Okay. Thank you everybody for joining us at today's webinar, Installing Charging at Apartments and Condos. My name is Devin DeLibero and I work on the Drive Green program here at Green Energy Consumers. I am the Electric Vehicle Program Coordinator, and with me here today is Anna Vanderspeck, who can introduce herself.
Hi everybody, my name is Anna. I'm the Electric Vehicle Program Director.
So Anna and I will be doing the first part of this presentation for you all. We'll be splitting it up, and then we'll be moving on to a Q&A session. So just some webinar logistics before we start. So obviously everybody is muted to avoid any background noise, but we will have a break at the end during the Q&A for questions. So please send any questions via chat, either at the end or as you just think of them during the presentation. Also, this webinar will be recorded and shared afterwards, so have no fear. We will send it all to you. Next slide, please. Uh-oh. Anna, can you send it to, oh, there we go. Okay. So we are part of Green Energy Consumers. That's who we work for. Our mission at Green Energy Consumers is to harness the power of energy consumers to speed the transition to a low carbon future. We do this in a myriad of different ways, but primarily through our program and policy advocacy work. We are based in both Rhode Island and in Massachusetts, so you'll hear us mention that both states in the presentation. And we talk so much about transportation because it is such a big factor in climate change. And because we started a program called Drive Green all the way back in 2016. It's primarily a tool to educate people about electric vehicles, but also a tool to help connect you to local dealerships to then potentially purchase an electric vehicle of your choice. And it is a great program. We've sold about 1,000 vehicles through the program. So if you're interested after this conversation, please do check us out. Next slide, please. Okay, so I kind of went over this a little bit, but today's agenda, we will first start off with a little presentation from myself and from Anna. We'll talk about why installing charging at apartments and condos is so important, how to start and complete the process, and also the current and future and potential future incentives for installing charging. Once that's concluded, we will have a Q&A with our panelists, Emily Kelly from ChargePoint, Austin Adams from Voltrek. If those words don't mean a lot to you right now, don't worry, they will explain who they are, and it'll make sense why they are our excellent panelists today. Next slide, please. Okay, so we'll first start by telling you about all the electric cars coming soon. So you'll notice even just driving around from now and from like a couple of years ago, there are a lot more electric vehicles just on the roads, and that has a lot to do with all the different models that manufacturers are now offering. A lot of different manufacturers like GM and like Kia and all these other different ones. They actually have some announcement that they've made that says like all of their vehicles will be electric by such and such dates. So we know that the manufacturers are buying into this. So we know even that more and more electric cars are coming soon. While we know that more cars are coming soon, it is a slower process. It's not something that's instantaneous because electric vehicles and vehicle purchasing in general is a big purchase and something that people make relatively infrequently. However, once you do have that, it's great for the cumulative electric vehicles in operation, which you'll see here illustrated on the graph. And it's also great for the used vehicle market because once those vehicles come off their first buyer, they then go to a used vehicle owner. IHS is a market forecaster, and they have predicted that the U.S. market share of electric vehicles will be 7.6% in 2026, so that is pretty good. We also know that more electric vehicles are coming because of different legislation that's been put into place both nationally and state by state. So in California, they are phasing out gas-powered cars by 2035. And we all know what California does. Massachusetts and Rhode Island are likely to follow, which they are. Massachusetts and Rhode Island also have state rebates for electric vehicles. So you'll see that more electric cars are definitely being incentivized and will be coming soon. Next slide, please. Okay. With that, there are different organizations that have done some studies that I wanted to bring to your attention today. So the first one here in the middle was a study done by Cultura back last year. And they wanted to know what opinions are on folks for phasing out gas-powered cars. What they found was very interesting. They found that 59% of Americans and 66% of Massachusetts residents have a somewhat or very positive opinion about electric vehicles, and that 49% of Americans and 56% of Massachusetts residents say they are very likely to purchase an electric vehicle. This is really great to hear about and really kind of reinforces what we've been saying all along, that people are ready for electric vehicles. However, roughly 1/3 of houses in Massachusetts and Rhode Island live in homes that they don't own. So it's really, really important that they have access to charging stations at home, because that can be a big obstacle for electric vehicle adoption. So that's why it's really important for apartments and condos to have these amenities available to their residents. On the right-hand side, you'll see we have some information about a consumer reports that was done back in 2020. That was done to gauge the interest in people actually purchasing electric vehicles. And so they did it by generation. And it is actually really positive feedback, even for this silent generation, because 58% is still more than 50%. So the silent generation has 58% of drivers that are interested in getting an electric vehicle, and that only increases as the generations get younger. You'll see millennials are 78% of them are interested in getting an electric vehicle at some point, and I'm sure for the generation below them, it's going to be closer to 100%. Next slide, please. Okay, so I just kind of said we need charging to support these cars. So we're kind of in a chicken and egg type of situation. So while electric vehicles are coming, there's plenty that are being manufactured. We really need charging station installation to be in place. There are plenty of charging stations being built through federal dollars and also state dollars. And then there's also utilities that are offering funding for charging stations, but those are primarily public charging stations, and we really need apartments and condos to have them as well. So in order to get these drivers to not have this obstacle, let's hope we can get more charging stations at apartments and condos. And with that, I will shift it to Anna.
Thank you, Devin. Devin has kind of laid out the why we need more charging stations for us all, but I'm here to talk a little bit more about the how. And the first thing that we have to do is acknowledge that this is a really complicated space. There is unfortunately no one-size-fits-all approach to installing charging stations at apartments and condos. And I want to go through some of the variables that explain that, because I think it'll help inform the conversation later. So first of all, the size of the parking lot and the demand for parking really matters. Installing charging in a really big parking lot that always has excess spots available is a really different question from installing charging in a lot where it's already really competitive and is overflowing. So the technology that you use and how you manage payment and all of that changes depending on variables like size. It also matters if that parking lot is multi-use or private. So there are some big apartment buildings that share public parking lots with supermarkets or businesses or other companies or institutions. But then there are a lot of apartments and condo buildings that have private parking where only people who live in that building are allowed to park. And that is another variable you have to take into account. You have to think about location. Specifically, is the parking lot close to an electrical panel, and is the particular spot that you want to electrify close to an electrical panel? The closer it is, the easier it is to install charging. The further away it is, the harder it is to install charging. And then finally, one question that really matters is parking currently unassigned or assigned? So do people in an apartment building or condo just park in a shared parking lot, but you park in a different place every day? Or do you always go to your one spot that is assigned to you? In both cases, it might make sense to install a shared charging station that people can sort of circulate through, or it might make sense to install charging only in specific spots, depending on who already has an electric vehicle. And then there's a further layer of complication of, even if the spots are assigned, who owns them and who gets to decide whether or not to make that investment to install charging stations. So all of these variables interact with each other to make lots of different potential settings. So if we say apartment or condo or charging at a multi-unit dwelling, there's a million different constellations of that, which makes this complicated. But the most important sort of underlying question that will be important to you if you live in an apartment or condo, or you want to see more charging in apartment and condos, is who is the ultimate decision maker? Who is it that you have to convince? Just to illustrate the range of examples that might fall into this conversation, this is an example of a parking lot that has, an apartment building that has a multi-use parking lot that it shares with other businesses. And there it might make sense to install a shared charging station that's effectively a public charging station that anybody can pull up to and use, but that just happens to be really close to people who live in that apartment building and that they can use. And you could have the exact same picture, but instead of making that charging station shared and open to the public, it could be limited to people who live in that apartment building by forcing you to put in a code or something to access that charging station. Then you might have a private parking lot or parking garage for an apartment building where parking is managed by a landlord and people have assigned spots. So this might be an example of one tenant has a Chevy Bolt and that landlord says, okay, I'll install a charging station for you at your spot. Or we could have a condo with assigned parking spots where it's actually individual condo owners who own the parking spots, which is a different situation in terms of who you have to convince than a physically exactly the same parking situation where it's a landlord who manages the parking lot instead. And then finally, because this is Massachusetts and Rhode Island, we've got to include the classic triple decker. With a shared driveway. There you might have a landlord who owns a building with maybe 3 units, and there's a sort of parking area next to or behind the house. That is very, very different from a giant apartment building with 50 units, but still falls into this bucket of apartments and condo buildings. So all of this to say is that there's a lot of variability here that we have to think about when we're talking about installing charging at condos and apartments. The good news, though, is that there are sort of key underlying benefits for whoever the decision maker is that can give you a hook to start this conversation if you do live in an apartment or condo. So installing EV charging can help both condos and apartments attract new tenants or improve retention. As we saw, increasingly people are looking to go electric, so they're going to be drawn to places that, facilitate the ownership of an EV. There are incentives, or have been incentives, and will be incentives to help landlords and condo owners actually make that investment. And just in general, offering EV charging is basically an amenity and also something that signals to people that you care about sustainability the same way that a garden might, or any other shared amenity in a space like an apartment or condo. So we have a couple of resources to help people navigate this process that are available on our website. So one of these resources is a basic, like, electric vehicles are coming. This is important for you to know if you own an apartment building or are part of a condo association. This is something that you should consider. So one of them, the one on the left, is a sort of very brief persuasive document that's like, this is something you should care about and that this is important for your business effectively. Then the document on the right gets into the nitty-gritty of a lot more of the details. So it'll talk about the different types of charging stations, how you manage payment, all of the different ways that you can set up charging in a shared lot. And that's something that is equally useful for tenants or people who live in a multi-unit dwelling who want to approach the decision maker and want to make sure they've got the answers to the questions that they know they're going to be asked. Or if you own a building and you are a landlord, it's a useful document for you too. To talk a little bit about how this all works, it is helpful to take one step back and talk about the two buckets of costs that a decision maker will have to think about if you want to install charging at an apartment or condo. So this graphic is actually pulled straight out of one of those resources that I just shared, and it shows you how electricity actually makes it from a generator to your car. So everything in the left box is not something that you or a landlord needs to worry about. This is the transmission. We generate the electricity, we send it out on the transmission network, and then the distribution network to a transformer, to a meter, and all of that is on the grid. That is the electric utility that owns and maintains all of that work. Where we start having to think about if we want to install charging in a parking lot or a parking garage, you will likely need to upgrade your property's electrical infrastructure. And this means everything from the panel to the conduit or the conductor that's bringing the charging to the charging pad. And then you have to actually purchase the unit and plug it into that electrical service. So up until now, in both Massachusetts and Rhode Island, electric utilities have offered help on the property electric infrastructure front through a program called Make Ready, where basically the electric utility has previously and will hopefully again soon covered the costs at multi-unit dwellings for the upgrades that you need to actually bring electrical service to the charging pad. And then the site host, the person who owns the property, only has to buy the actual unit and pay for the installation, which is much, much lower if you don't have to pay for the service upgrades. So when we're talking about incentives coming up, we're going to think about them in terms of like property infrastructure upgrades and then the actual supply equipment. You might notice that I've been saying have had and will have again soon, and that is because we're in an awkward spot right now in between different incentive programs. Excuse me. So this is a table that will go through by column that shows current, sort of upcoming, to be determined, and expired incentive programs to help cover the costs of charging at apartments and condos. So starting at the federal level, there has been a federal tax credit for a couple of years that covers 30% of the cost of installation, and that is in place through the end of this year. The Inflation Reduction Act that passed this summer extends that tax credit for another 10 years, but it adds a bunch of new rules that are complicated and not entirely clear. So there will be a federal tax credit available next year, but exactly who qualifies for it and where is still up in the air. So we are waiting for rules from the Internal Revenue Service to make that really clear so that we can start saying, okay, if you live in this kind of a building in this place, the federal tax credit will apply, and in these other places it doesn't. So that is something to stay tuned for in the new year. If you live in Massachusetts, there is a program in the Mass Department of Environmental Protection, DEP. It's called Mass EVIP. And that program offers 60% of the hardware/installation costs. So not the property infrastructure upgrades, but the actual hardware and installation of the hardware, of up to $50,000 for buildings with at least 5 residential units. So unfortunately, that 5 residential unit limit cuts out a lot of the apartment buildings that are in Massachusetts, all the triple deckers where there's 2 or 3 or 4 units. But it does cover a lot of the larger apartment buildings and condo buildings. So that can really bring down the costs for a property owner. The 2 big electric utilities in Massachusetts, National Grid and Eversource, have historically had a make-ready program where they would cover the costs of, again, bringing electrical service to the charging pad for multi-unit dwellings. And last year, they proposed a new version of that program for the next couple of years. And that went into a formal docket process at the Department of Public Utilities that we were official interveners in. So we were submitting our comments on what we thought the DPU should approve. And right now we are waiting for DPU approval. So once the DPU issues a final order, the electric utilities will know what they have permission to run, and they'll start getting their make-ready plans programs back up and running. So there will be funding available there. We just don't know how much or for exactly what kind of buildings yet. And then finally, Governor Baker just passed or signed into law a couple days ago a big economic development bill. And that law included $50 million for an EV charging infrastructure deployment fund. So we don't quite know yet how the state is exactly going to use that money. It might just put those dollars into the Mass EVIP program. It might set up a new program. That all remains to be seen, but those are dollars that will definitely be intended to help this thorny issue of how do we get charging installed in apartments and condos. And then finally, in Rhode Island, the picture is a little sadder. There's no current program to help cover the costs of charging. There was a make-ready program back when National Grid was the electric utility for the state of Rhode Island. Now National Grid sold its business in Rhode Island to a new company, so the new electric utility is called Rhode Island Energy, and it's kind of TBD what their plans will be for electric vehicles in the coming years. So that is something that we are actively advocating on and keeping an eye on. And then secondly, Rhode Island used to have a program that was basically analogous to the Mass EVIP program called Electrify RI, and that was administered by the Office of Energy Resources and ran out of funds over a year ago. So that is a bucket of funding that we would like to see replenished. If any of you were on the webinar yesterday about Rhode Island's greenhouse gas reduction plan, funding programs like that was identified as one of the priority actions that the state should take. So we're hopeful to see progress on that front in the next year, but right now there's just nothing, which is not a comforting thing to have to say, but hopefully in the new year we might see some progress. So with that, we will bring on our 2 panelists, Emily Kelly from ChargePoint and Austin Adams from Voltrek. And we'll start with just basic introductions, and then we can get into questions that we have prepared, but also questions coming in from you all in the chat. So I will stop sharing my screen for now so that we can just have a conversation. And I know Devin was having some internet issues, so it might just be us. And I'll start by asking you, Austin, to introduce yourself and also Voltrek.
Thank you so much, Anna. My name is Austin Adams, and I'm an account manager here at Voltrek. And basically what we do is we are a full turnkey provider of EVSE equipment, services, and everything that you need, from consulting and basically holding your hand through the process of applying for all these different grants that she just spoke about, whether it's Massachusetts EVIP or even the Eversource. So we help you guys take care of all that.
Thanks, Austin. Emily, go ahead.
Great. Hey, everyone, and thanks, Anna, for the chance to be a part of this. My name is Emily Kelly. I'm a public policy manager with ChargePoint. So I cover our state legislative engagement and public policy efforts here throughout the Northeast. I'm based in upstate New York. A little bit about ChargePoint. So we are a EV charging software and hardware provider. We were founded in 2007, headquartered in Campbell, California. We internally build, design, and manufacture both charging and software. Very much consider ourselves a market leader in the EV charging industry throughout North America and Europe. We currently have over 200,000 ports worldwide and 300,000 with our roaming agreements with other EV charging companies. We design and manufacture all different kinds of charging products, you know, from home chargers to level 2 workplace chargers, and then DC fast chargers as well. And our business model is a little different than some of the other charging companies. So we typically don't own and operate the chargers ourselves, but we provide these smart network charging solutions directly to businesses and organizations, and then they become the site hosts and owners and operators of the chargers. And we're also lucky to work with Voltrek as a local channel partner of ours that resells ChargePoint software and hardware. So happy to be here and answer questions.
Great. I don't know, Devin, how much of this you are hearing with the delay, but my
I can hear it.
Oh, go ahead, you go.
I'm excited.
Ironically, you froze and turned into a robot just as you were saying that.
So we have a few different questions prepared that we might just.
I think we're gonna abort mission on this one. Sorry, Devin. I am curious, at what stage in the process do people come to you? Like, if you are someone who lives in an apartment building, should you start thinking about installing a charger before you get a car, after you get a car? Who are the people coming to you, and at what point in the process?
So for us, we mainly do commercial. So we also do apartment buildings and complexes as well, especially since the city of Boston has now essentially mandated it, where if you're doing any new construction, you have to have 25% of your parking spaces have power for EV cars. They do have a point system, so it's not exactly one for one. But you really want to start thinking about it as soon as possible. And I would say before you get the car, because it can be a very, very long process, unfortunately, especially when you're applying for different grants. That process takes quite a while. Plus, you also have to think about the lead time on not only the chargers themselves, but also any additional infrastructure that you might have to add to make it ready for, like you were saying earlier, for the make ready process. That could be bringing in additional service requests from Eversource. And then from that point, you might have to add transformers, and so a lot of the transformers are on back order. There's just a lot of things that you really have to think about and have to start the conversation as early as you can. That way you can, based off your individual project, you can try to figure out what your timeline will be. Because what we're experiencing now is people are reaching out to us and they say, oh, well, we ordered our car and it's supposed to be here in a couple of months, but it takes months to get your grant approved by Mass EVIP, and then you might have to wait months for the charger. And then you might have to wait months to get everything you need from an infrastructure standpoint. So there's a lot of moving parts in this, so you really want to start the process as soon as you can. Because what I'm seeing right now is I have a lot of people that have cars, but I can't put in the chargers because the chargers aren't available, or we're waiting for the Mass EVIP grant to come through. And I did just want to touch on something that you said earlier. So Mass EVIP, it can actually cover between 60 and 80%, depending on how this is set up. So if you were to apply as a MUD, a multi-unit dwelling, so what happens is if you just do it for that, it's 60% for your tenants. However, if you have a situation, and I've run into this a couple of times, where they have a garage for their tenants, but they also have additional parking, and if you're okay with opening up that additional parking for anyone, which would go under a different program, which would be called public access, you could save up to 80%. And both of those programs also cover the make ready process. So it would cover the charger itself, It would cover the 60% of the install and also the make ready. So if you had to bring in a transformer so that you had enough power to charge however many stations that you're planning on putting into your establishment, it would also cover that as well. The only time that it wouldn't cover that is if you're also applying for Mass EVIP or National Grid. Excuse me, Eversource or National Grid. If you apply for those where they tend to pay 100% of the make ready itself, you can't double dip. They don't allow you to double dip there.
We have some questions coming in. Oh, Emily, go ahead.
No, I would just very much echo everything that was just said. I would say in general too, like there's just so many challenges with supply chain issues right now and getting products ready to go on so many different fronts that totally agree. Start thinking about it as soon as possible. And yeah, I think it's just important to recognize that, yeah, even some of the utility back-end work that may need to be done, those may take time too, and there's supply chain issues with that part of the process too. So just would echo the as soon as possible advice that was given.
Hopefully we will soon enter a world where it's a little bit faster so that you don't have to plan, but that is just where we are right now. I see a lot of questions coming in. So one I want to ask right off the bat, in our regular Electric Vehicle 101 webinars and our charging webinars, we talk about the different types of charging. And generally, when we're talking about charging, we're either talking about level 2, which is 240 volts, at somewhere between 10 and 30 miles per hour spent charging. And that's usually what we hear about when we're talking about installing charging in apartments and condos. And then there's DC fast charging, which is the super high powered charging where you can do like 80% of a battery in half an hour, and it's usually along highways. And one of the questions we have is it ever appropriate really or useful to install DC fast charging at an apartment or condo?
It's really overkill to be completely honest, unless now if it's a mixed use type situation, and I'm actually working on a project right now to put in 13 DC like super fast chargers, like 175 kW type stations in downtown Boston. It makes sense in that application because it's a mixed use where they're doing it more to create some dwell time for their commercial tenants and not so much for the residential tenants. For the residential tenants, we're putting in something that's much more appropriate and slower, because when you think about it from a residential standpoint, I mean, your car is at least going to be at home for 8 to 10 hours a day minimum, right? Theoretically speaking, you're gonna sleep 8 hours a day, hopefully. That's not true for everybody, but I hope. So your car should be there, right? So if you also want to try to plug in when time of use rates are low, and that's usually overnight. So companies like ChargePoint, which is who we lead with, because they have an all-in-one setup with their software and their hardware, and they're very, very easy to deal with. You can actually even program it inside of your software so that it'll start charging at a particular time. That way you can stay away from, if your particular area, depending on who your utility is, you can stay away from time of use fees. But DC charging, just to get back to the question, DC fast charging for an apartment complex is unnecessary.
Emily, I see you nodding. Agreed. I agreed. I think unless it's mixed use, like you said, I agree that it's typically unnecessary, and you can go with a level 2 charger, be much cheaper overall, and hopefully charge when you're parked and when you're sleeping. So agreed.
So I'm looking at the questions that are coming in, and there's a couple of questions that are specific to a particular situation. And I actually think it would be useful to just run through a couple of those and talk through them, because again, we talked about how there's so many different constellations and there's no one size fits all, but just to sort of hear how you would answer a couple of these questions. Great. So one person, sorry?
That's great.
Oh, okay, cool. So one person writes, wait, I lost it. Okay. My 20 unit condo building has deeded spaces for each unit but no room in the private lot for an additional floating parking space for a shared EV charger. So everybody has their own assigned parking spot. There's no additional one. Do you have any thoughts on how it could work aside from installing chargers ad hoc somewhere near the deeded space for any EV owners?
So that's where things get a little bit complicated, because you wouldn't qualify for the grants if it's a deeded parking space. So you'd have to come out of pocket 100% on that. Now, then that opens up another, a few more questions, and when that's really going to break down to is who's going to be paying for the electricity. So and it also depends on how it's wired. So if you had a couple of people there, if you don't physically have the spaces, what you would likely have to do is put and this is typically what we do. We use a charge point product, which is called a CPF 50, which pulls 50 amps of power, and you need an 80 amp circuit. And you would do those individually, and those stations are a lot less expensive than some of the other stations that you might be looking at for an apartment complex itself. However, they provide plenty of power for while people are parking. But the issue is it really comes down to an electrical situation and how they're going to get the power and who's going to pay for it. And the reason I say that is because if they're okay with paying for the power, you could get around it and just pull the wire either from a house panel or from their particular panel itself. For that, I don't know how this particular place is set up, but if they're okay with paying for the power, it would probably just make sense to just buy a little cheapy charger that they could just plug into, or designate one specific spot if there is one, if there's just some place where they can find a spot where they can just put it in and just have that one station, but everyone would have to share. So that could get a little iffy, especially if it's a station that's non-networked, because there's no way to charge the person that's using the power. And there's also no programs where you could, if someone's done, someone could theoretically hog the station all night and their car could be charged. That would be more of a consult type question. Because this is really hard because there's just so many different variables that come into play here.
This is, I think, your response to that question to me illustrates the frustration that I wish you could say step 1, step 2, step 3, then you're done. But you do need a consult because it really matters so much from one spot to another. Let me see, there's a lot of questions coming in. Sorry, Emily, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I would reiterate to those same thoughts that it can be challenging, it gets complex, but I think folks should know that companies like Voltrek or ChargePoint, and there's others out there, if you have questions, we can help. I think that's the takeaway there, is that, reach out and we can help navigate that complexity for you, because it is hard to figure that out on your own. So just, I think, letting folks know that companies like ours can help is my main takeaway.
What I might do is shift over to some more general questions, and you both just referred to networked versus non-networked chargers, or free charging versus charging where the person pays for the electricity they're using. Can you speak to how that works in an apartment or condo, what basically the two options are on that front, and how you would decide which one to go with?
Absolutely. So a non-network station means that anyone can pull up and plug in their car, and they're going to receive free electricity from their perspective. Now, whoever owns the property or wherever the power is coming from, they will get the bill. Now, with a network station, which is all that we really deal with for us, because we tend to do commercial and multi-unit dwellings, apartments, complexes, et cetera, we do almost exclusively networked, because it gives you flexibility and it gives you the opportunity. It just gives you the ability to charge. you don't have to charge, or you can select who you charge. So if one of the perks of being on the HOA is free charging, you could do that, and you make everybody else pay. And it's also on the spot. So if, theoretically speaking, the utility company, like in New Hampshire where I live, just decides they want to double or triple their rates, you can on the spot increase how much money you're going to charge. So if your expenses change where it comes to the station, you can in real time manage that and handle it. So if you need to increase the pricing, you can do that right on the spot. It gives you other really cool features where if somebody was trying to hog one of the spaces and park their car overnight, and the car's been there for 10 hours, and you know that it hasn't been charging for 6 of those 10 hours, more than likely, you can charge them parking fees so that they're more likely to go move their car so that someone else has access to that charger that might need it. That is a very, very popular feature. It also gives you the ability to see, depending on how many chargers you have, it allows you to see if there's an issue. It can forewarn you. It can also update itself, because everything is done on a wireless plan. So instead of using like Wi-Fi or anything like that, what it does is it actually connects to Verizon, T-Mobile, or AT&T, and it can update itself without having to do anything. And then if there's issues, people can also leave comments like, the charger in spot 32 doesn't work for some reason. So they can alert someone else, and it goes right into whoever manages their dashboard. So I mean, there's just, they are more money. However, it gives you a lot more flexibility. And then, not to say that a charging station is going to create a lot of ROI, because in reality it's really not. It needs to be looked at as an amenity. Now, it can cover your expenses as far as if you're getting charged, and I'm just going to use nice round numbers just so it's easy to follow. So if your utility company is charging you 20 cents per kW, you can decide to charge 30 cents per kW and basically try to cover some of your expenses throughout the year, because there are network fees. There's a subscription that you have to pay for on an annual basis. There are some other expenses that go along with it, but I mean, this really, I know a lot of people try to look at this as an opportunity for ROI, and putting in a charger really isn't that. It would be more of an amenity. And there's zero, and if you have a non-network station, there is no, you don't have the ability to even recoup any of your expenses or your costs, because it's just, people just pull up and they can plug in. Now you can give, so one of the ways around that as well, if you have a network charger, is you can select access. So you could shut it off and just have it just for your tenants only, and not for visitors, or if people find it on a ChargePoint app or on an EV app, or they just find out that, oh, they drove by and said, I saw they have a charger over there, and they can just try to go plug into it. You can set it up so that's not capable. It doesn't work.
That's what I was going to reiterate too, are those access controls. And if you are in a place where it's like mixed use, multi-unit dwelling, parking and some public parking too, and the site host wants to allow for residents to have more of an opportunity to charge at certain times, or things like that, that's really important, I think, for including network charging for this use case.
And as a side note, it can also save you a ton of money on the infrastructure as well, because through the software, if you don't have enough power to, let's say you wanted to put in 20 chargers, but you only have enough power for 10, you can control it. You can throttle down the power through the software. We can also do it through the infrastructure itself, which is something we also do, because what I've found in a lot of these apartment complexes is there's not a whole lot of power left over. Most of the power, when they did that initial design, whenever that complex was built, there's not a whole lot of excess power available. So sometimes what happens is, and this can get really pricey, is we have to bring in additional services or or put in more transformer, or put in a transformer or a much larger transformer than the one that they have. Add additional panels because there's not enough room in their panel to put in, you know, the breakers for all the different chargers. So it can save you a lot of money from that aspect, and that's something that we do a lot with it. Is if we don't have enough power, we can control it through the software, and then we can also help manage it through the hardware itself inside of your panel.
Okay. Thank you for that answer. I think that is one of the really key concepts to get through when it comes to this, is the networked and non-networked and how you control access. So we have about 15 minutes and about 300 questions. So I'm going to do my best to go through them maybe a little rapid fire. I have had a lot of people write in and say, wait, there's no incentives if the parking spots are deeded. Could you speak to that?
I can. So for mass EVIP, if the parking spot is deeded and only one person can use it, it doesn't qualify.
And that is likely also true for the Make Ready plans, although the details of that are still TBD because they might offer incentives now for individuals too.
My understanding is that there could be some money available through Eversource and National Grid. However, like you just said, it has not been approved. I actually had a call this morning with National Grid. We deal with National Grid and Eversource every week. So we're being told that we should see something in the next, by the end of the year, probably for Eversource, and probably not so soon, or not as soon for National Grid. But there could be some, my understanding is that there is going to be some money available for that. I don't want to speak to it because it's not approved and I don't know, and I don't want to give out false information.
We've spent a lot of time already just talking about how complicated all this is and how specific it is to a particular building. And so one person asked, what is the cost of getting advice from a company like ChargePoint or Voltrek about how to move forward?
We don't charge for that.
I don't believe we do either.
Yeah, no, we'll come out. I mean, so typically our process is we would have like a Zoom call or a Google Meet real quick. We discuss your project. I'd go into Google Earth. You tell me a couple of quick things. I'm thinking about putting some chargers over here. You know, our electrical room is kind of over here. We discuss a little bit, just a brief scope of your project, what you're looking to accomplish. And then we would talk about any potential incentives that you might qualify for. And then if it's something that you're interested in, we can come out. I'll bring out my project manager, my electricians, and construction guys as well, if need be, depending on your area and where you are. And then we just go from there. And then we'll give you a quote, and we just go from there. And you say yes, that's great, or you say no, I don't want to do it. Pretty easy.
Emily, anything to add, or should I jump to the next question?
You can jump to the next one.
So there are a couple of questions about costs, which is what is the range of total cost with all of these things? And I'll say that one of the resources I mentioned has a really nice graphic about the sort of range of costs depending on what charging station you're looking at. Is it networked or not, and how many, and all of that. But when people ask you that question, do you have a ballpark figure that you give them, or how do you respond to that question?
You really can't give a number, but if I have to give something, it's usually $10,000 to $15,000 per plug. But again, it could be
incentives.
Significantly less than that. Like I'm doing a project in down in Mass, and it's not going to be anywhere near that. It's probably going to be closer to about $5,000 per plug, because the electrical room is literally next to the parking spots. So there's no trenching. We don't have to break up a sidewalk or a driveway or a parking lot. We're just running wire through a wall and then right there to the station, and bada bing, bada boom, done. It's super easy. I'm so excited for that one. Because that's usually not the case. They have the power, they have the room in the panel. It's just an unbelievable situation. So that's usually what I say, 10 to 15 grand per plug. Again, it could be significantly more, and it could be a lot less as well too. But that's kind of an average number.
When we were just talking about types of charging, we talked about level 2 and we talked about DC fast charging, but there is a third one, which is called level 1, which is the slowest type of charging. It's a trickle charge. It's you plug your car into the same kind of outlet you would plug your cell phone or your laptop into. Is that a solution for maybe condo units like we just talked about, because people stay parked overnight and it's cheaper to install?
I mean, in all reality, it could be. It's not necessarily a great solution because the amount of time that it would take for you to charge your car could be 28 hours or 24 hours, 22 hours.
Yeah,
and
or even more.
some of them, it really depends on the car, because the car is the one that dictates how much power it pulls. So if you have, the Volvo or a Ford Lightning or something like that, that would not be feasible, because it would take more power just to condition the battery than it would be completely pointless. Now, if you have like a plug-in hybrid or something like that, like you have a Chevy Volt, or you have like the Subaru, I think theirs is a plug-in hybrid. There's the Toyota has a handful of them. Honda's got a couple, I believe, as well. That might be a little bit better because those batteries are much smaller. They're not 80 or 100 kW kilowatt hour batteries. They're probably closer to like 25 or something like that. So that would actually, it could potentially work for you. Inside of Boston, that you get, I think, 1 point or half a point for that. So if you're just trying to get to your points and don't really care about it being a real amenity, that could be somewhat of a Band-Aid in their point system, but it's not very effective if you have a full EV, if you have a full battery electric vehicle.
I will say that when we give our EV 101 webinars, we actually talk about level 1 charging working for a lot more people than you might think. If you drive 40 miles a day, you can plug in for 10 hours and basically recoup that. So I'll, I guess, soften your comments a little bit by saying it depends on how much you drive. If you're driving that Ford Mustang Mach-E 200 miles every day, you want a level 2 charging station. But if you're driving down the street to the supermarket and to pick your kid up from soccer practice, level 1 might be something to look at.
That would be perfectly fine. Like if you don't do a lot of driving, if you do 50 miles a week or 200 miles a week or something like that, then that would be fine. But if you have any type of real commute or do any driving, then the level 1 wouldn't work very well. But it also depends on the car too. It's and that's why these conversations are so hard to have, because there's just so many variables. It's like an algebra project. It's just there's letters and numbers and all kinds of stuff, and you're just like, okay.
Okay, I'm going to, in recognition of the fact that we've got about 5 minutes left, ask 2 questions and then the follow-up question, which is maybe too ambitious. One question is quick but important, which is, can you talk about requirements for handicapped access? So in a parking lot that is limited space, you need to have a dedicated parking spot for handicapped access. How do you balance that with where you install charging?
So Mass EVIP requires the ADA parking space. So you have to hatch a parking space for a landing zone for somebody that could potentially have disabilities. There's also requirements as to the height of the station and how that it's installed. That way there's enough room. There's also a requirement for room in front of the station as well, to make sure that someone has at least, typically what we do is we will hatch out a parking spot next to, or either next to the very first one or right in the middle, and then we'd put the station in between the we'd have the hatching space in the center, and then we'd have the charger in the middle, and then we'd have 2 open. That way you kind of have essentially 2 landing zones, and just kind of, just double your opportunity there, because we do have some flexibility in the length of the charging of the cables themselves. So that is something that that is really a site by site challenge, and a lot of times it is a challenge, or it's just something that just takes a little bit of thinking to try to figure out, because for the most part, usually the parking garages for the complexes are tight. And not only are they tight, the parking spaces are a little bit smaller than in a parking lot per se. So it does take a little bit of planning, but it is something that's required to get the money. So you have to figure it out one way or another. I will say that for EVIP, you're required to keep that space hatched for 3 years. Then after that, you can reclaim that parking space. And that's part of the conversation that we have during the consulting phases. Do you plan on getting that parking space back? Because then we would put the ADA landing space next to one particular spot instead of putting it in the middle.
Yeah, and Austin, those are, just to follow up on that, those are federal guidelines, right, in relation to ADA that have to be followed. That's not specific to Massachusetts, the way I understand it.
Well, it's specific to this grant. You don't have, if you're not going to go through Mass EVIP, you don't have to worry about a landing spot or an ADA space. That's a Mass EVIP thing. If you want to just put a charger in your garage for one of your tenants, you can just do that and not have to worry about a landing zone or anything like that.
And I would note too, just because we're starting to engage in this conversation, is that the U.S. Access Board is currently looking at expanding their design recommendations for accessible electric vehicle charging stations. So we may see more regulations come out eventually regarding ADA requirements and EVSE, but I think that's still to be determined. But I know it's something that we're engaging on now, and we'll probably know more about soon. But it's definitely an important issue that will continue to be talked about, I think.
Yeah, it's coming. It just hasn't hit yet.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, we have 2 minutes, so I will ask 2 questions and you can pick which one you want to answer, or both, very fast. So one is, someone writes they're in a condo and any improvement requires that 75% of the people vote in advance. So how do you address that? And then my second question is there one common misconception that you keep hearing about installing charging in apartments and condos that you just want to set the record straight on? And those will be our sort of closing thoughts before we finish up.
Okay, so the HOA is usually the hardest thing to get around. And in a condo situation like that, where you have to go to vote and you need 75% of the votes, what I would do is typically what I have people do is put together a questionnaire and give it to all their tenants. And then especially the HOA people, and say, look, figure out how many EVs you currently have, whether they're full BEVs or they're plug-in hybrids. Figure out how many cars you have versus how many tenants that you have. And then the follow-up question to that is, are you thinking about getting a partially electric vehicle in the next 1 year, 2 year, 3 years, or whatever? And then just put together a little questionnaire. I've had some success with that. And they had initially gone, in one particular instance, they had gone to a vote, failed miserably. And then I went back to them. I said, look, put together this, reach out to all your tenants. And then they found that in the next 3 years that there was a significant percentage of their tenants that were heavily considering getting an EV. And then at that point, they were able to push it through, and we started and went into further discussions. And we're still not there yet. We haven't installed the stations, but we're significantly closer than we were 6 months ago. That's for sure. And then for misconceptions, I'm sorry, Emily, did you want to say something?
No, I would echo that. And I would also encourage you to see if, I don't know what state you're in or if you're in the city of Boston, but there is a policy called a right to charge law that I know we personally advocate for at ChargePoint on the state level, which basically says it provides residents at a multi-unit dwelling or another property with the right to install a charging station for your individual use, provided that certain conditions are met. So it doesn't require that the property has to pay for everything, but it's in law that you have the right to install a charger, and that your homeowners association can't tell you that you can't. And so there's different pieces to these laws, and depending on what state you're in, it may say something different. But I know the city of Boston has enacted that, so I would just encourage you also to see if that right to charge law exists, and then what the requirements are there, because that may help you in getting past like an HOA board, or even if you're a renter too. And if you have more questions on those laws, let me know, because I can get you those answers, but just something to know.
As far as the misconceptions goes, people just don't realize how complex this really is. It takes a lot of people to put these designs together in most scenarios, especially in the multi-unit arena. It takes a lot of electrical design, reaching out to the utility company to try to make sure that we can get more power. I mean, it's very, very complex. It's not as simple as, oh, we'll just put some wires in there and just hook it up to this thing and I'll charge my car. It's unfortunately, I wish it was that easy, but unfortunately it's not. And start having the conversation sooner than later is the biggest thing I can say, because I'm seeing a lot of people that are really in a rush because they already have the car, but they don't have a charger. So now they're going to the mall and sitting in the parking lot for an hour while they charge their car because they don't have a charger set up.
I was really hoping your misconception was going to be, it's really not as hard as people think, but this is where we are right now.
But we're here to help.
Well, let me rephrase that. It wouldn't be so difficult if the supply chain was like pre-COVID. This wouldn't be as big of a deal because you could just call your utility company, say, hey, I need a new service. They'd come right out, give us the new service. We wouldn't have to wait for transformers or machines. It's not hard on your end as a consumer. It's only hard on my end. It's not hard for you guys. It's just hard on my end. That's it.
I like the reframe. Emily, any last thoughts?
No, I mean, echo what Austin said, and just reiterate that companies like ours are here to help navigate the process for you and help find grants and incentives. And ChargePoint, I'm part of the policy department, so trust me when I say we're advocating at the state government level, the local level, for any sort of policies that will help accelerate adoption, help reduce the cost for consumers. So we are doing that work on the policy side, and we're dedicated to continuing to do that. So hopefully we will see good things to come in both Massachusetts and Rhode Island moving forward.
Thank you for the positive note. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Austin.
I was going to say, just take advantage of all this money that's out there while it's still there. I mean, Mass EVIP's given a lot of money away. The state of Massachusetts has given money away. The feds are giving money away in the IRA in the form of tax rebates. And, just take advantage of the money while it's here. Because at some point, there's going to be, they're just going to run out of money and you're just going to miss out.
We had such a positive note, and then we had. But on that note, I want to recognize that we're over time. So thank you for those of you who stuck with us for a little bit longer. I am contractually obligated to say that it is our 40th year as an organization. And if you enjoyed this presentation, we've got lots more on our events page. And if you are able and interested in donating to us, we are always grateful, but particularly right now we have a matching donor. So it's an excellent time to donate if you're so inclined. But I will also say thank you one more time to you, Emily and Austin, for joining us today. I'm sorry for the several dozen questions we did not get to, but we'll send out a follow-up email with some of the resources we mentioned, the recording and the slides, and we'll see you again soon.
Sounds good. Thank you, Anna.
Bye.